Hi, I'm Allison. 3 hours ago, I walked into my Denver home to find my mother-in-law Linda smashing my grandmother's china set with a hammer while my father-in-law Robert filmed it for social media. They were laughing. My sister-in-law Brittany was stuffing my handmade quilts into garbage bags, calling them dusty old rags that were embarrassing the family. What they didn't know was that I had already called my lawyer 2 weeks earlier. What they also didn't know was that I had been secretly recording everything for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The destruction of my home wasn't random. It wasn't even spontaneous. It was calculated, planned, and designed to break me completely. But here's what Linda, Robert, and Brittany Parker didn't realize when they decided to wage war on my belonging. I had been preparing for this moment far longer than they had been planning it. Let me take you back to where it all started, because the moment I walked through that door and saw the carnage wasn't really the beginning. The real beginning was 18 months earlier, on a snowy December evening in the Highlands District of Denver, when I first realized my marriage to David Parker came with a price I wasn't sure I could afford to pay. David had been traveling for work again, something that happened more frequently as his construction company expanded across Colorado. I was alone in our modest two-bedroom house, the one we had bought together 3 years into our marriage, the one where I had carefully arranged every room with pieces that told the story of who we were becoming together. My grandmother's antique china cabinet stood proudly in the dining room, displaying the delicate blue and white porcelain that had been passed down through 4 generations of women in my family. The quilts my great-aunt had sewn by hand draped over the backs of our living room furniture, their intricate patterns catching the lamplight in the evening. Framed photographs covered the mantelpiece, documenting our relationship from awkward first dates to our wedding day, mixed with pictures of my parents and grandparents, people who had shaped me long before David entered my life. That particular evening, I was in my home office working on a freelance photography project when I heard the front door open. I expected David, but instead, Linda's voice carried through the house with its familiar edge of criticism disguised as concern. She had let herself in using the spare key David had given her months earlier, a decision I had protested but eventually accepted to keep peace in our marriage. I walked downstairs to find Linda standing in my living room, hands on her hips, surveying my carefully curated space like a home inspector finding violations. She wore her usual uniform of pressed slacks and a cardigan that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the December wind outside. Robert stood behind her, scrolling through his phone with the detached air of someone who had learned to let his wife handle the emotional labor of family conflicts. "Allison, honey," Linda began, her voice carrying that particular tone that always made my shoulders tense. "We need to have a conversation about this house." She gestured around the room as if she were pointing out fire damage. David's been too polite to say anything, but it's time someone addressed the elephant in the room. I had learned early in my relationship with David that his family operated under a specific hierarchy. Linda was the undisputed queen, making decisions about everything from holiday celebrations to career choices for her adult children. Robert provided financial backing and silent agreement to whatever Linda determined was best. Brittany, David's younger sister, served as Linda's enthusiastic second-in-command, always ready to amplify her mother's opinions and add her own layer of judgment to any situation. David, despite being 32 years old and financially independent, still sought his mother's approval on major decisions. When we were dating, I found his close family ties endearing. I came from a smaller family where my parents encouraged independence and respected boundaries. The Parker family's constant involvement in each other's lives seemed warm and supportive from the outside. It wasn't until after our wedding that I began to understand the difference between closeness and control. "What elephant would that be, Linda?" I asked, settling into the armchair that had belonged to my grandmother, a subconscious choice that I would later recognize as my first act of quiet defiance. Linda's smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. "This old furniture, sweetie. These outdated decorations. David is moving up in the world and his home should reflect that success. A man in his position needs a space that says something about his achievements. Not," she paused, looking directly at the china cabinet, "not a museum of someone else's past." The weight of her words settled over me slowly, someone else's. My family, my history, my inheritance from women who had worked and saved and created beautiful things with their hands, all of it dismissed as clutter that was holding David back from achieving some undefined level of social success that Linda had determined was necessary. These pieces have been in my family for generations, I said carefully, keeping my voice level. They're not just decorations, they're part of who I am. Robert looked up from his phone long enough to nod in Linda's direction. Your wife needs to understand priorities, son, he said, though David wasn't even in the room. A man's home is his castle, and castles don't have yard sale furniture. The casual cruelty of reducing my grandmother's handcrafted china cabinet to yard sale furniture took my breath away for a moment. These weren't random pieces I had picked up at thrift stores. The china had been my great-grandmother's wedding gift, carefully preserved through the Depression and 2 world wars. The quilts had been sewn by my great-aunt during the long winters of the 1960s, each stitch placed with intention and love. The photographs documented my family's journey from immigrants to established Americans, faces that looked like mine, stories that shaped my understanding of resilience and dignity. But in the Parker family's world, none of that mattered because none of it reflected their values or enhanced their social standing. My heritage was an inconvenience, a collection of outdated items that needed to be cleared away to make room for whatever Linda considered appropriate for her son's home. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said, standing up from my grandmother's chair. This is David's and my home. We make decisions about our space together. Linda's expression shifted from false sweetness to barely contained irritation. Of course, dear, but David has been too kind to hurt your feelings about these things. He mentioned to me just last week how embarrassed he was when his colleague from the construction company stopped by and saw this. She gestured around the room again. This collection of antiques, it's not the image a successful contractor wants to project. The lie was so smooth, so confidently delivered, that for a moment I wondered if David had actually said those things. But I knew my husband, knew his respect for family history, and his genuine appreciation for craftsmanship. David had never expressed anything but pride in the pieces I had brought to our home. In fact, he often told visitors the stories behind various items, enjoying the way my face lit up when I explained the significance of a particular quilt pattern or the journey a piece of china had taken to reach our dining room. I'll discuss this with David when he gets home, I said, moving toward the front door in a clear signal that the conversation was over. But Linda wasn't finished. Brittany has offered to help with the transition, she continued, ignoring my obvious desire for them to leave. She has such wonderful taste, and she knows exactly what kind of furniture would suit David's professional image. We were thinking a complete refresh, new dining set, modern living room furniture, something that shows David's success rather than dwelling on the past. The word transition hung in the air like a threat. This wasn't a suggestion or even a strong recommendation. Linda was announcing a plan that she expected me to accept, a complete erasure of my family's presence in my own home. She wasn't asking for my input or considering my feelings. She was informing me of a decision that had already been made in whatever private family meeting I hadn't been invited to attend. That's very generous of Brittany to offer, I said, my hand on the doorknob, but we're happy with our home the way it is. Robert finally looked up from his phone with the expression of someone who had grown tired of watching a child throw a tantrum. Allison, you're being selfish, he said with the casual authority of someone who had never been questioned. This isn't about what you want anymore. This is about what's best for David's future, and you're standing in the way of that. The accusation of selfishness for wanting to keep my family's belongings in my own home was so absurd that I almost laughed. But there was something in Robert's tone, a finality that suggested this conversation was merely a courtesy notification rather than an actual discussion. They had already decided what needed to happen. My opinion was irrelevant. After they left, I sat in my grandmother's chair and looked around the room with new eyes. Every piece suddenly felt vulnerable, threatened by people who saw my heritage as an obstacle to their vision of success. The china cabinet that had survived my great-grandmother's immigration, my grandmother's moves across 3 states, and my parents' various relocations now faced its greatest threat, in-laws who viewed its existence as a personal inconvenience. When David returned from his trip 3 days later, I told him about his parents' visit. His reaction was everything I had hoped for and feared it would be. He was genuinely shocked by their audacity, apologetic about their behavior, and completely supportive of keeping our home exactly as we liked it. But there was something else in his response, a weariness that suggested this wasn't the first time his family had overstepped boundaries, and a resignation that implied he knew it wouldn't be the last. "I'll talk to them," he promised, holding me close in our living room surrounded by the furniture they wanted to replace. "They had no right to come here and say those things. This is our home and your family's things are part of what makes it special." But even as David reassured me, I could see the conflict in his expression. He loved his family despite their flaws, and he loved me despite the complications my presence created in their tightly controlled family dynamic. He was caught between loyalty to the people who had raised him and commitment to the woman he had married, and that position was wearing on him in ways that would become more apparent as months passed. The conversation David had with his parents must have been more diplomatic than definitive, because while the direct pressure about my furniture temporarily stopped, other forms of criticism increased. Linda began making pointed comments about my cooking when we attended family dinners, suggesting that David looked thinner and wondering aloud if he was getting proper nutrition at home. She questioned my career choices, expressing concern that freelance photography wasn't stable enough for a woman whose husband was trying to build a business. She criticized my clothing choices, my hairstyle, and my tendency to prefer quiet evenings at home rather than the social events she believed were necessary for David's professional networking. Each criticism was delivered with the same false concern, the same suggestion that she was only thinking of David's best interests. And each time, David found himself in the position of defending his wife while trying not to completely alienate his family. The stress of constantly mediating between us was taking its toll on our marriage, and I could see Linda's strategy beginning to work. The real turning point came 6 months later, during a family barbecue at Linda and Robert's sprawling house in the suburb. David had been delayed at a job site, leaving me to attend alone with promises that he would join us as soon as he could. I should have stayed home, but we had already confirmed our attendance, and I didn't want to give Linda another reason to criticize my commitment to family obligation. I arrived to find the entire extended Parker family in attendance, aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who had known David since childhood. Everyone was gathered on the back patio, drinks in hand, engaging in the kind of comfortable conversation that comes from years of shared history and mutual understanding. I moved through the crowd, making polite conversation and trying to find my place in a group where I would always be the outsider who had married into their established dynamic. Brittany approached me with a drink, and what appeared to be genuine friendliness. At 28, she shared her mother's sense of style and social confidence, but she had always seemed more approachable than Linda, more willing to include me in conversations and family jokes. I had hoped that she might become an ally, a bridge between me and the Parker family's expectations. "Allison, I'm so glad you made it," she said, linking her arm through mine in a gesture of sisterly affection. "I've been wanting to talk to you about something exciting." She led me away from the main group, toward a quieter corner of the patio where we could talk privately. I followed willingly, grateful for her attention and curious about whatever plan she wanted to share. "I know Mom came on a little strong about the furniture situation," Brittany began, her voice low and conspiratorial, "but I have an idea that might work better for everyone." She explained that she had connections with several interior designers through her work in real estate, people who specialized in creating sophisticated spaces for professional men. They could help David and me transition to a more contemporary aesthetic, while finding respectful ways to incorporate a few selected pieces from my family collection. It would be a compromise that honored my heritage while creating the kind of environment that would support David's growing business reputation. The proposal sounded reasonable, even thoughtful. Brittany had clearly put effort into finding a solution that addressed her mother's concerns, while acknowledging my attachment to my family's belonging. She spoke about the process with enthusiasm, describing how the designers would work with us to select the most meaningful pieces and find appropriate ways to display them in a modernized space. "I could even help with the costs," she offered. "Consider it my contribution to David's success." "These designers aren't cheap," but the investment would pay off when David starts entertaining clients at home. I found myself nodding along, seduced by the idea of a compromise that might finally bring peace to the ongoing tension about my furniture. If professional designers could find a way to blend my family's antiques with a more contemporary style, perhaps everyone could be satisfied. Brittany's offer to help financially was generous, and her apparent understanding of my emotional connection to these pieces made me feel heard and respected. "That sounds wonderful," I told her. "I'd love to discuss it with David when he gets here." Brittany's smile broadened. "Actually, I was hoping we could surprise him. I know how stressed he's been about balancing everything, and it would be such a relief for him to come home and find that we've solved this problem together." The suggestion made sense. David had been working long hours, and the ongoing tension between his family and me was adding pressure to his already demanding schedule. If Brittany and I could present him with a thoughtful solution that satisfied everyone's concerns, it would remove one source of stress from his life and demonstrate my willingness to find middle ground with his family. "When would this happen?" "The designers have an opening next week," Brittany replied. "They could come by Tuesday afternoon for an initial consultation. David mentioned he'd be working late that day, so it would be perfect timing. We could have everything planned before he gets home, and then present him with the proposal." I agreed to the consultation, feeling optimistic about finally resolving the furniture conflict that had been poisoning family gatherings for months. Brittany hugged me with what seemed like genuine affection, thanking me for being so understanding and flexible. For the first time since joining the Parker family, I felt like I might have found an ally who could help me navigate the complex dynamics of their expectations. David arrived at the barbecue an hour later, tired but happy to see me mingling comfortably with his family. He didn't notice that I had just committed to a decision that would change everything about our home, and I didn't tell him because I wanted to surprise him with our solution to a problem that had been weighing on both of us. The interior design consultation was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I took the afternoon off from my freelance work, tidied the house, and prepared to welcome Brittany and her design professionals into my home. I had spent the weekend thinking about which pieces meant the most to me, ready to have thoughtful conversations about how to honor my family's history while creating a space that reflected David's and my future together. But when Tuesday afternoon arrived, Brittany showed up alone. She stood on my front porch with a clipboard and measuring tape, her designer handbag perfectly coordinated with her professional-looking blazer. There were no interior design professionals, no thoughtful consultation about blending styles or honoring family heritage. Just Brittany with a list of measurements and what she described as preliminary planning for the transition. "Where are the designers?" I asked, stepping aside to let her in, but already feeling a familiar twist of anxiety in my stomach. "They'll come later," Brittany said, moving through my living room with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "First, we need to catalog everything so they know what we're working with." She began taking photographs of every piece of furniture, every decoration, every personal item that made my house feel like home. She measured the china cabinet, examined the quilts with a critical eye, and made notes on her clipboard that she didn't share with me. The process felt less like a consultation and more like an inventory, as if she were documenting evidence for some purpose I didn't understand. "This is going to be so much better," she said, photographing my grandmother's rocking chair from multiple angles. "David is going to be thrilled when he sees how professional everything looks." But there was something in her tone, a satisfaction that didn't match the collaborative spirit she had described at the barbecue. She was taking pictures of my belongings with the focus of someone planning their removal, not their integration into a new design scheme. Every measurement she recorded felt like a step toward something I hadn't actually agreed to, despite my presence and participation in the process. "When will I see the design proposals?" I asked, watching her photograph the framed pictures on my mantelpiece. "Soon," Brittany replied, not looking up from her clipboard. "The designers need time to develop options that will work with David's professional image." That phrase, "David's professional image," had become a constant refrain in every conversation about my home. It was the justification for any change the Parker family wanted to make, the trump card that made my own preferences seem selfish and short-sighted. David's professional image apparently required the elimination of anything that connected me to my own family, my own history, my own sense of identity within the space we share. After Brittany left, I sat in my grandmother's rocking chair and tried to shake the feeling that I had just participated in something other than what I thought I was agreeing to. The house felt different somehow, violated by her intensive documentation of every personal item I owned. She had photographed things that weren't even furniture, books, artwork, small decorative objects that my parents had given me over the years. The scope of her inventory suggested a much more comprehensive change than the thoughtful blending of styles she had initially described. I called David at work intending to tell him about the consultation and get his thoughts on the next steps, but when I tried to explain what had happened, the words felt wrong in my mouth. I realized I wasn't entirely sure what I had agreed to, or what Brittany was planning to propose to the mythical designers who hadn't appeared for our scheduled meeting. "It sounds like she's being helpful," David said, distracted by whatever project was demanding his attention. "I trust Brittany's judgment on this stuff. She helped Mom redecorate their house, and it turned out great. But I hadn't seen Linda and Robert's house before Brittany's involvement, so I had no basis for comparison. And I was beginning to suspect that helpful meant something different to the Parker family than it did to me. The design proposals never came. For 3 weeks, I waited for Brittany to contact me with the professional recommendations she had promised. When I texted her for updates, she responded with vague assurances that the designers were still working on concepts and would be in touch soon. When I suggested meeting for coffee to discuss the timeline, she said she was too busy with work but would call me when she had something concrete to share. Meanwhile, Linda resumed her campaign of subtle criticism about my home during family gatherings. She made comments about the outdated wallpaper in my dining room, suggested that the living room felt cluttered with too many personal items, and wondered aloud whether David felt comfortable bringing colleagues home to such an old-fashioned environment. Each comment felt like a test, a way of measuring whether Brittany's consultation had softened my resistance to their vision for my home. David, caught between his family's opinions and his loyalty to me, began making small suggestions that echoed his mother's concern. Perhaps we could consider updating the dining room wallpaper.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Maybe the living room would feel more spacious with fewer decorative items on display. His suggestions were gentle and framed as joint decisions, but they followed so closely on his family's comments that I recognized their true source. The breaking point came on a cold February evening when I discovered Linda and Brittany's real plan. I had been working late in my home office, editing photographs from a wedding shoot, when I heard voices in the kitchen. David was supposed to be working late again, so I was surprised to hear conversation downstairs. I walked quietly toward the stairs, thinking perhaps he had come home early and brought someone with him. But the voices belonged to Linda and Brittany, and they were discussing my furniture with the casual authority of people who had every right to make decisions about my belongings. "The china cabinet is the biggest problem," Linda was saying. "It dominates the entire dining room and makes everything else look cheap. Once that's gone, we can start fresh with something appropriate." "The quilts are almost worse," Brittany replied. "They make the living room look like a nursing home. I found some beautiful modern throws that would coordinate perfectly with the sectional I picked out." I stood frozen on the stairs, listening to them plan the complete replacement of my family's belongings, as if I weren't a factor in the decision. They spoke about my grandmother's china cabinet like it was a piece of trash to be disposed of, my great-aunt's quilts like they were embarrassing relics that had overstayed their welcome in my own home. "When are you planning to do this?" Linda asked. "David's going to be out of town next week for that project in Colorado Springs," Brittany replied. 3 days should be enough time to get everything moved out and the new pieces delivered. By the time he gets back, it'll be a fait accompli." "And Allison?" Brittany's laugh was cold and confident. "She'll adjust. Once she sees how much better everything looks, she'll understand that we were right. And if she doesn't, well, David will choose what's best for his future." I backed up the stairs silently, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they would hear it. They weren't planning to consult with me or present design options for my consideration. They were planning to wait until David was out of town and simply remove my family's belongings from my home without my knowledge or consent. It was theft disguised as interior decorating, a hostile takeover of my personal space by people who had decided my opinions were irrelevant. I spent the rest of the evening in my office, pretending to work while my mind raced through the implications of what I had overheard. Linda and Brittany had used my desire for family harmony against me, pretending to offer a compromise while actually planning a complete erasure of my presence in my own home. They had counted on my politeness, my willingness to find middle ground, my reluctance to create conflict that would put David in an impossible position. But most disturbing was Brittany's confidence that David would ultimately support their decision, that he would choose his family's vision for his future over his wife's connection to her own heritage. She seemed certain that once the deed was done, once my belongings were gone and replaced with furnishings that met the Parker family's standards, David would see the wisdom of their intervention, and I would have no choice but to accept the new reality. That night, after David came home exhausted from work, I lay awake beside him planning my response to their planned invasion. I could confront them directly, but that would put David in the position of choosing between his wife and his family, a battle I wasn't certain I would win. I could tell David what I had overheard, but he was already stressed by the constant tension between his loyalty to me and his family's expectations. Or I could do something they would never expect from the polite, accommodating daughter-in-law who had always tried to keep peace in the family. I could fight back with the same strategic planning they were using against me, but with one crucial advantage: this was my home, and I had rights they were choosing to ignore. The next morning, I called Carmen Rodriguez, my closest friend since college and the one person who had consistently warned me about the Parker family's manipulation. Carmen was a paralegal at a family law firm downtown, and she had been watching my in-laws' behavior with the trained eye of someone who recognized emotional abuse when she saw it. "They're planning to break into your house and steal your furniture," Carmen said after I told her what I had overheard. "That's not family drama, Allison. That's criminal behavior." She was right, of course. Regardless of their relationship to my husband, Linda and Brittany had no legal right to enter my home and remove my belongings without my consent. Their plan constituted breaking and entering, theft and destruction of property. The fact that they were David's family members didn't give them special privileges to violate my rights as a homeowner and property owner. "What can I do?" I asked. "Document everything," Carmen advised. "Start recording conversations, taking pictures, saving text messages. Get evidence of their plan so you have proof if you need it later, and call a lawyer. You need someone who can help you protect your rights before they violate them." That afternoon, I had a consultation with Patricia Williams, an attorney who specialized in family law and property rights. I explained the situation carefully, emphasizing the systematic nature of my in-laws' campaign against my belongings and their plan to remove items from my home without permission. Attorney Williams listened without judgment, taking notes and asking clarifying questions about ownership, documentation, and the timeline of events. When I finished my account, she was quiet for a moment, processing the legal implications of the Parker family's planned action. "Your in-laws are planning to commit multiple crimes," she said finally. "Breaking and entering, theft, possibly destruction of property. The fact that they're related to your husband doesn't give them any legal right to your belongings or access to your home." She explained my options for legal protection, including restraining orders, documentation requirements, and the process for filing criminal charges if they followed through on their plan. She also helped me understand my rights as a property owner, and the steps I could take to protect my belongings before any violation occurred. "The most important thing," Attorney Williams emphasized, "is to document everything from this point forward. If they're planning to act next week, you need evidence of their intentions and their actions." I left her office with a clear plan and a new sense of empowerment. For months, I had felt helpless against the Parker family's systematic campaign to erase my presence from my own home. I had tried to be accommodating, to find compromises, to maintain peace for David's sake, but their plan to simply take my belongings without my consent had crossed a line from family conflict into criminal behavior, and I finally had the tools to fight back. The week David was scheduled to leave for Colorado Springs, I implemented my protection plan with the precision of someone who had finally stopped being a victim and started being a strategist. That Tuesday morning, I installed hidden cameras in every room of my house. Carmen had helped me research the legal requirements for recording in my own home, and Attorney Williams had confirmed that I had every right to document activities on my own property. The cameras were small, discrete devices that could record both video and audio, strategically placed to capture anyone who entered my home without permission. I also changed the law. It was a decision I should have made months earlier, but I had been trying to maintain peace with David's family, trying to be the accommodating daughter-in-law who didn't create unnecessary conflict. But their plan to enter my home and steal my belongings had eliminated any obligation I felt to preserve their access or comfort. When David called me from his hotel in Colorado Springs that evening, I told him I was having the locks changed for security reasons. There had been break-ins in the neighborhood, I explained, and I wanted to feel safer while he was traveling. It wasn't entirely a lie Linda and Brittany were planning to break in, even if they had convinced themselves that their family relationship gave them permission to violate my home. That's probably a good idea, David agreed. I should have thought of that myself. Will you give spare keys to Mom and Brittany so they can check on you while I'm gone? The request was innocent from his perspective, a thoughtful suggestion from a husband who wanted his family to look after his wife during his absence. But I knew that giving Linda and Brittany keys would simply enable their plan to remove my belongings. They were counting on having access to my home, and David's suggestion would have handed them exactly what they needed to complete their theft. I'll be fine on my own, I told him. Carmen is going to stop by a few times, and I have plenty of work to keep me busy. David accepted my explanation without question, trusting that I could take care of myself for the 3 days he would be away. He had no reason to suspect that his mother and sister were planning to use his absence as an opportunity to redecorate our home according to their preferences, removing everything that connected me to my own family in the process. Wednesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of February weather that made staying indoors feel like the only reasonable choice. I worked from my home office, editing photographs and responding to client emails, but my attention was divided between my computer screen and the security app on my phone that connected to the hidden cameras throughout my house. At 11:30, a white van pulled into my driveway. I watched through my office window as Linda stepped out of the passenger seat, followed by Brittany and 2 men in work uniform. They approached my front door with the confidence of people who expected to be welcomed inside, carrying boxes and moving equipment as if they had every right to be there. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by Linda's voice calling through the door. "Allison, honey, we're here to help with the furniture project we discussed." I didn't answer. I sat at my desk, watching the security footage on my phone as Linda tried the door handle, expecting it to open with the spare key that no longer worked. I could see her confusion as she jiggled the handle, then her growing irritation as she realized the locks had been changed. Brittany joined her mother on the front porch, and I could hear their muffled conversation through the door. They were discussing their options, clearly frustrated that their plan was already encountering obstacles. One of the men with them suggested trying the back door, and I watched on my security cameras as they walked around the house, testing every possible entry point. When they realized that all the locks had been changed, Brittany called my phone. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message with a mixture of anger and satisfaction. "Allison, it's Brittany. We're here for the furniture consultation we talked about. I think there's been some confusion about the timing, but the movers are here now and we need to get started. Can you please open the door so we can begin the process we agreed on?" The message was carefully worded, designed to sound reasonable to anyone who might hear it later. Brittany was creating a narrative that positioned their attempted entry as a planned consultation rather than the unauthorized invasion I knew it to be. She was counting on my politeness, my desire to avoid conflict, my reluctance to make a scene that might embarrass David's family. But I had moved past politeness. I had documentation of their real intentions, legal advice about my rights, and security footage of their attempted entry into my home without permission. For the first time in my marriage, I held the power in a conflict with the Parker family, and I intended to use it strategically. I called Attorney Williams from my office, speaking quietly while watching Linda and Brittany pace around my front yard, clearly agitated by their inability to access my home. "They're here," I told her. "They brought movers and they're trying to get inside. Don't let them in," she advised. "Don't engage with them at all," Let them document their own attempted break-in while you document their behavior. This is evidence of their criminal intent. For the next hour, I watched Linda and Brittany circle my house like frustrated predators, testing windows and calling my phone repeatedly. The two men with them appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, asking questions I couldn't hear but could interpret from their body language. They had been hired to move furniture, not to participate in a family conflict that was beginning to look like attempted burglary. Finally, one of the movers approached Linda directly, and I could see their heated conversation through my front window. He was shaking his head, pointing to his truck, clearly stating that he couldn't remove items from a house without the homeowner's permission. Linda gestured angrily toward my front door, but the mover was backing away, unwilling to participate in whatever legal complications her plan might create. The movers left first, loading their equipment back into the white van and driving away despite Linda's protest. I watched her make frantic phone calls, probably trying to find other movers willing to take on a job that the first company had recognized as legally problematic. Brittany tried a different approach. She walked to my front door and spoke directly to the wood, her voice loud enough for me to hear clearly through the house. "Allison, I know you're in there. You're being ridiculous about this whole situation. We're trying to help David's career, and you're sabotaging your own husband's success because you're too attached to old junk that doesn't matter to anyone but you. David is going to be furious when he finds out you've been this difficult about something that would benefit both of you." Her words were designed to manipulate me, to activate the guilt and self-doubt that had kept me compliant for so many months. She was trying to reframe my protection of my own belongings as selfishness, my defense of my home as sabotage of David's career. In the Parker family's world, my resistance to their theft was the real problem, not their plan to steal my possessions. But I had moved beyond their manipulation. I sat in my home office, recording their attempts to guilt me into compliance, documenting their frustrated efforts to gain access to my home, gathering evidence that would support my legal protection of my own property. Linda's approach was more direct. She called my phone again, and this time I answered, putting the call on speaker so my security system could record our conversation. "Allison, this is absolutely unacceptable," she began without preamble. "You've wasted everyone's time and money with this childish behavior. We had professional movers scheduled, and you've embarrassed the entire family by refusing to cooperate with a plan that would benefit everyone." "I never agreed to have my furniture removed from my home," I replied calmly. "I agreed to a consultation with interior designers, which never happened." "Don't be naive," Linda snapped. "You knew exactly what we were planning. Brittany explained everything to you, and you nodded along because you knew it was the right thing to do for David's future." "Brittany told me we would work with professional designers to blend my family's pieces with new furniture," I said. "She never mentioned removing everything I own and replacing it without my input." "Your input isn't relevant anymore," Linda replied, her mask of false politeness finally slipping completely. "David is a successful businessman, and his home needs to reflect that success. Your grandmother's old furniture makes him look poor and unsophisticated. If you cared about your husband's future, you would stop being selfish and let us fix this problem." The word "fix" revealed everything about Linda's perspective. My family's belongings weren't just inappropriate for her vision of David's success, they were a problem that needed to be eliminated. My connection to my own heritage was an obstacle to be removed. My presence in David's life, a complication to be managed and controlled. "This is my home," I said quietly. "These are my belongings. You have no right to remove anything from my house without my permission." "We'll see about that," Linda replied, and hung up. The threat was clear, though not specific. Linda wasn't accepting my refusal as final. She was planning to find another way to achieve her goal, another method of removing my belongings from my home. I had won this battle by changing my locks and refusing them entry, but the war was far from over. That afternoon, Carmen stopped by to check on me and review the security footage from the morning's attempted invasion. We sat in my living room, surrounded by the furniture Linda and Brittany had tried to steal, watching their frustrated efforts to gain access to my home. "They're not going to give up," Carmen observed, watching Linda pace around my front yard with increasing agitation. "People like this don't accept being told no, They just find different ways to get what they want. She was right, of course. The Parker family had operated for years without anyone challenging their authority or refusing their demand. Linda was accustomed to getting her way through persistence and manipulation, and my successful defense of my home would only make her more determined to find a vulnerable point she could exploit. What do you think they'll try next? I asked. Carmen paused the video on a frame showing Brittany speaking angrily into her phone. They'll probably try to turn David against you, make him choose between keeping you happy and keeping them happy. They'll frame this as you being unreasonable and difficult, and they'll pressure him to override your decisions about your own belongings. The strategy made sense from the Parker family's perspective. They had been working for months to position me as the obstacle to David's success, the selfish wife who cared more about old furniture than her husband's professional advance. My refusal to allow their theft would fit perfectly into that narrative, giving them new ammunition for their campaign to convince David that I was the problem in our marriage. But I had advantages now that I hadn't possessed before. I had documentation of their attempted break-in, recordings of their threats, evidence of their plan to steal my belongings. I had legal counsel who understood my rights and strategic advice about protecting my property. Most importantly, I had finally stopped trying to accommodate people who viewed my compliance as their right rather than my choice. When David called that evening, I told him about his family's visit in careful, factual terms. I explained that Linda and Brittany had arrived with movers, planning to remove furniture from our home without consulting me. I described their frustration when they discovered the locks had been changed, their attempts to pressure me into allowing them access, and their threats when I refused to comply. David's reaction was everything I had hoped for and feared it would be. He was shocked by their behavior, apologetic for their actions, and completely supportive of my decision to protect our home, but there was also confusion in his voice, a bewilderment that suggested he couldn't quite understand how the situation had escalated to this point. I'll call them right now, he promised. This is completely unacceptable. They had no right to do any of this. But even as David reassured me, I could hear the weariness in his voice. He was tired of being caught between his family's demands and his wife's resistance, exhausted by the constant conflict that seemed to escalate no matter how many conversations he had with his parents and sister. He loved me, and he supported my right to keep my belongings in our home, but he was beginning to resent the position these conflicts put him in with his family. The conversation David had with his parents that night must have been heated, because Linda called me the next morning with a different approach. Her voice was controlled but cold, the tone of someone who had been forced to retreat, but wasn't accepting defeat. Allison, David is very upset about yesterday's misunderstanding, she began. He feels terrible that you were confused about our plans, and he wants to make sure we can work together to resolve this situation in a way that makes everyone comfortable. The word misunderstanding was doing a lot of work in that sentence, transforming their attempted theft into a simple miscommunication. Linda was rewriting history, creating a version of events where their invasion of my home was the result of confusion rather than criminal intent. There was no misunderstanding, I replied. You planned to remove my belongings from my home without my permission. That's theft regardless of your relationship to my husband.
You're being very dramatic about a family conversation, Linda said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used when she wanted to make me feel foolish. David is concerned that you're overreacting to a situation that could be resolved easily if you were willing to be reasonable. The implication was clear. David was now questioning my perspective on the situation, influenced by his family's version of events. Linda was suggesting that my husband was beginning to see me as the unreasonable party in this conflict, the difficult wife who was making problems out of simple family discussions. I'd like to speak with David directly about his concerns, I said. He's very busy with work, Linda replied quickly. But he asked me to let you know that he thinks it might be helpful for all of us to sit down together when he gets back. A family meeting where we can discuss everyone's feelings and find a compromise that works for everyone. A family meeting. The phrase sent a chill through me, because I understood what it really meant in the Parker family's vocabulary. It meant a gathering where Linda would control the narrative, where I would be outnumbered 3-1,
where my perspective would be presented as unreasonable and my resistance to their plans would be framed as selfishness that was hurting David's future. "I'll discuss that with David when he calls me," I said, and hung up before Linda could continue her manipulation. But David didn't call that day or the next. When I tried calling him, my calls went to voicemail, and his return calls came at times when I was working with clients and couldn't answer. We were playing phone tag, missing each other's attempts at communication, but the pattern felt deliberate rather than coincidental. On Friday morning, Carmen stopped by again to help me review the security footage from the week and plan my strategy for David's return. We sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by printouts of the legal documentation Attorney Williams had prepared, reviewing the evidence I had gathered of his family's attempted theft. "They're isolating you from David," Carmen observed, looking at the timeline of missed calls and delayed messages. "Classic manipulation technique. They want to control the narrative about what happened this week before you can give him your version." She was right, and I could see the strategy working. David's family had 3 days to influence his perspective on the situation, while I had only brief, unsatisfying phone conversations to present my side. They could paint my actions as overreaction and paranoia while positioning themselves as the reasonable parties trying to help our marriage. "What should I do when he gets home?" I asked. Carmen looked around my living room, taking in the furniture that Linda and Brittany had tried to steal, the family photographs they wanted to replace, the quilts and china that represented my connection to my own heritage. "Show him the security footage," she said. "Let him see exactly what his family planned to do to your home. Let him watch them try to break in, listen to them threaten you, see them bring movers to steal your belongings. Don't let them rewrite what happened. Make him see the truth." That afternoon, I prepared for David's return like a lawyer preparing for trial. I organized the security footage chronologically, created a timeline of events with supporting documentation, and gathered the legal advice I had received about protecting my property rights. I wasn't going to let Linda and Brittany's manipulation campaign succeed. David was going to see exactly what his family had attempted to do to our home. When David's truck pulled into our driveway Friday evening, I was ready. I met him at the front door with a kiss and a calm demeanor, determined not to let the stress of the week show in my face or voice. He looked tired from his trip and the family drama that had apparently dominated his phone calls while he was away. "We need to talk," he said, setting down his overnight bag in the entryway. "Yes, we do," I agreed. "I have some things to show you." We sat together in our living room, surrounded by the furniture his family had tried to remove, and I played the security footage from Wednesday morning. David watched in silence as his mother and sister approached our home with moving equipment, tested our doors and windows when they couldn't gain entry, and made frustrated phone calls when their plan was thwarted. His expression changed as he watched the video, moving from confusion to shock to anger. He could see clearly that this wasn't a consultation or a family discussion. It was an attempted theft, carefully planned and deliberately executed while he was out of town. "They brought movers," he said quietly, staring at the screen showing the white van in our driveway. "They came here planning to empty our house," I replied. "If I hadn't changed the locks, you would have come home to find all of my family's furniture gone and replaced with whatever Brittany selected." David replayed the footage, watching his family's behavior with new eyes. He could see their sense of entitlement, their assumption that they had the right to enter our home and remove my belongings without permission. He could hear Linda's voice on the recorded phone calls, dismissing my rights as a property owner and framing my resistance as selfishness. "I can't believe they would do this," he said, though his voice suggested he was beginning to understand that his family was capable of exactly this kind of violation. "They've been planning it for months," I told him, showing him the text messages Brittany had sent about the fake design consultation, the photographs she had taken of my belongings, the timeline of their systematic campaign against my furniture. David spent an hour reviewing all the evidence I had gathered, seeing his family's behavior documented in their own words and actions. He couldn't dismiss it as misunderstanding or overreaction because it was all there in clear, undeniable detail. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally. It was the question I had been dreading, because I knew that any answer I gave would force David to choose between his loyalty to his family and his commitment to our marriage. If I demanded that he cut contact with his parents and sister, I would be asking him to sacrifice relationships that had shaped his entire life. If I asked for nothing, I would be enabling their continued violations of our boundaries and inviting future attempts to control our home. I want you to support my right to keep my belongings in our house, I said carefully. I want you to tell your family that they will never again have access to our home without both of us present. And I want you to understand that if they attempt anything like this again, I will file criminal charges. David nodded slowly, processing the boundaries I was setting and their implications for his relationship with his family. He understood that I wasn't asking him to choose between them and me. I was asking him to choose between their demands and my rights as his wife and co-owner of our home. I'll talk to them, he promised. This stops now. But even as David made his commitment to protect our home and my belongings, I could see the cost of this conflict in his expression. He was exhausted by the constant tension between his family's expectations and my boundaries, worn down by having to defend his wife against people who claimed to love him. The Parker family's manipulation was working. Even in defeat, they were making our marriage the price of my resistance to their control. That night, as we lay in bed in our house full of furniture his family had tried to steal, I realized that David's promise to talk to his family wouldn't be enough. Linda and Brittany had shown that they were willing to commit crimes to achieve their goals, and they wouldn't be deterred by conversations or requests for respect. They would simply find new ways to attack what I valued, new methods of erasing my presence from David's life. I was going to need more than David's support to protect myself from his family. I was going to need legal protection, public documentation, and strategic planning that anticipated their next move. The battle for my home was over, but the war for my marriage was just beginning. The conversation David had with his family that weekend was supposed to end their interference in our home. He spent 2 hours on the phone with Linda and Robert, explaining that their attempt to remove my furniture was unacceptable and that they would need to respect our decisions about our own house. He spoke with Brittany separately, making it clear that her role in planning the unauthorized entry had damaged his trust and her judgment about family matters. But by Monday morning, I discovered that the Parker family's response to David's confrontation wasn't retreat, it was escalation. I was working in my home office when Carmen called with urgency in her voice. She had been monitoring social media as part of her job at the law firm, and she had found something that made her stomach drop. "Allison, you need to see Linda's Facebook page right now. She's posted something about you and it's already being shared." I opened Linda's profile with a sense of dread, knowing that whatever she had written would be carefully crafted to make me look unreasonable while positioning herself as the victim of my difficult behavior. What I found was worse than I had anticipated. The post was titled "When Mental Illness Affects the Whole Family," and featured a lengthy description of my increasingly erratic behavior over the past several months. Linda wrote about her concern for David's well-being as he struggled to manage a wife who was showing signs of severe anxiety and paranoid thinking. She described my attachment to old furniture as hoarding behavior, and my refusal to allow family members into my home as evidence of isolation and irrational fear. The post was accompanied by photographs of my house taken from the street, showing what Linda described as excessive security measures that I had installed to keep family members away. She had photographed the new locks, the security cameras, and even the closed curtains, presenting them as evidence of my deteriorating mental state rather than reasonable protection against her attempted theft. Linda's writing was skillful and manipulative, using clinical-sounding language to pathologize my normal responses to her family's violations of my boundaries. She described her attempt to help redecorate my home as a loving gesture that I had misinterpreted due to my inability to distinguish between helpful family support and imagined threat. My documentation of their behavior became obsessive record-keeping, and my consultation with a lawyer became evidence that I was seeking validation for delusions of persecution. The comments section was filled with supportive responses from Linda's friends and extended family members,
all expressing sympathy for the difficult situation she was managing and offering advice about dealing with mentally ill family members. Several people suggested that David needed professional help to cope with the stress of being married to someone with untreated psychological problems. But the most damaging element of Linda's post wasn't the false narrative about my mental health. It was the way she had positioned herself as the concerned mother-in-law trying to save her son from a dangerous situation. She wasn't the villain attempting to steal my belongings. She was the hero trying to protect David from his unstable wife. I screenshot the entire post and the comments, then called Attorney Williams immediately. This wasn't just family drama anymore. It was defamation, deliberately crafted to damage my reputation and credibility in preparation for whatever Linda planned to do next. "This is witness tampering," Attorney Williams told me after reviewing Linda's post. "She's trying to discredit you before you can present evidence of her criminal behavior. This suggests she's planning something that will require people to believe her version of events rather than yours." The attorney explained that Linda's social media campaign was likely the first step in a larger strategy to isolate me from potential supporters and create a narrative that would justify more extreme action. By establishing that I was mentally unstable, Linda was providing cover for future violations of my rights that could be framed as necessary interventions rather than criminal behavior. "We need to respond quickly," Attorney Williams advised. "The longer her narrative exists without challenge, the more people will accept it as truth." That afternoon, I crafted my own response, not an emotional rebuttal, but a calm, factual statement supported by documentation. I created a detailed timeline of Linda's family's behavior toward me, including screenshots of Brittany's messages about the furniture consultation, photographs of the security footage showing their attempted break-in, and copies of the legal documentation I had obtained to protect my property rights. I posted the timeline on my own social media accounts with a simple statement: "Mental illness stigma is used by manipulative people to discredit those who set boundaries against their abuse. Here is documented evidence of what really happened when I refused to allow my belongings to be stolen from my home." The response was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive. Friends who had known me for years recognized Linda's post for what it was: a calculated attack designed to make me look unstable for refusing to be victim. Colleagues from my photography work shared their own experiences with clients who had used mental health accusations to avoid accountability for their behavior. Even people I barely knew commented on the clarity and organization of my documentation, noting that my evidence-based response didn't match Linda's description of someone experiencing paranoid delusions. But the public confrontation also escalated the conflict beyond anything I had anticipated. Within hours of my post going live, Linda called David at work, sobbing about the vicious attack I had launched against her online. She claimed that my sharing of security footage violated her privacy and that my accusations of attempted theft were slanderous lies designed to destroy her reputation in the community. David came home that evening torn between supporting his wife's right to defend herself and managing his family's devastation at being publicly exposed. He understood that Linda's social media post had been an unfair attack on my character, but he was struggling with the implications of our conflict becoming a public battle that would permanently damage relationships within his family. "They're saying you've declared war on the family," he told me, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Mom is talking about consulting a lawyer about defamation, and Brittany says you're trying to turn me against them by making them look like criminals." The irony was staggering. Linda and Brittany had literally attempted to commit crimes against my property, but they were positioning themselves as the victims of my documentation of their behavior. They had brought movers to steal my furniture, but I was the aggressor for having security cameras that recorded their attempted theft. "Do you think I should have let them remove my belongings from our house?" I asked David directly. "No, of course not," he replied immediately. "What they planned was completely wrong, and you had every right to protect our home. Then you understand why I documented their behavior and why I defended myself when your mother attacked my mental health publicly." David nodded, but I could see the conflict in his expression. He supported my actions intellectually, but emotionally he was struggling with the reality that protecting his wife meant accepting that his family had behaved like criminals. The people who had raised him, who claimed to love him, had planned to steal from his home and then attacked his wife's sanity when their plan was thwarted. The situation became more complicated when Robert called David the next day with a different approach. Instead of emotional manipulation, he offered what sounded like a reasonable compromise. The family would apologize for the misunderstanding about the furniture and promise never to enter our home without permission again. In exchange, I would remove my social media posts and agree not to pursue any legal action against them for what Robert characterized as a family miscommunication that got out of hand. They want to pretend it never happened, I told Carmen during our daily check-in call. Robert is offering an apology in exchange for my silence about what they actually did. Carmen's response was immediate and sharp. They're not apologizing because they're sorry. They're apologizing because your documentation makes them look bad. If you agree to silence now, you're giving up your ability to protect yourself when they try something else. She was right, of course. Robert's proposed compromise wasn't accountability. It was image management. The Parker family wanted to control the narrative about their behavior, erasing the public record of their attempted theft in exchange for promises they had already broken multiple times. But David was being worn down by the constant conflict. His family was calling him daily, expressing their hurt and confusion about my overreaction to what they continued to characterize as a well-intentioned offer to help. They were painting my documentation of their crimes as vindictive behavior that proved I was the real problem in our marriage. Maybe we should consider the compromise, David suggested tentatively. If they're promising never to do anything like this again, maybe we can put this behind us and move forward. I looked at my husband, seeing the exhaustion in his face and understanding the impossible position the Parker family had put him in. They had made our marriage the battlefield for their control, forcing him to choose between supporting his wife's rights and maintaining peace with his family. David, if someone attempted to break into a stranger's house and steal their belongings, would you advise that stranger to accept an apology and promise never to report the crime? That's different, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. How is it different? David was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of his family's behavior when stripped of the emotional manipulation that came with their blood relationship to him. When strangers committed crimes, legal consequences were appropriate and necessary. But when family members committed the same crimes, he was being asked to prioritize their comfort over justice. I don't know how to fix this, he said finally. You don't fix this, I replied gently. You accept that your family chose to commit crimes against your wife and you decide whether you're going to enable that behavior or protect your marriage. The next morning, I received a call that changed everything about our situation. Carmen's voice was tight with anger when she told me what she had discovered through her contacts at the law firm. Linda hired a private investigator, she said. Someone from our office recognized your name on a background check request. She's trying to find information she can use against you. The revelation was both shocking and inevitable. Linda had escalated from theft to defamation, to hiring professionals to investigate my personal history, looking for ammunition she could use to destroy my credibility and reputation. She was treating our family conflict like a legal war, using resources and strategies that went far beyond normal family disputes. Attorney Williams confirmed that the background check was legal but indicated a level of escalation that required immediate response. She's building a case against you, the attorney explained. This isn't about furniture anymore. She's trying to find something she can use to paint you as unfit, unstable, or dangerous. This is a systematic campaign to destroy your position in David's life. The private investigation felt like a violation that went beyond anything Linda had attempted before. She was digging into my past, my relationships, my professional history, looking for something she could weaponize against me. She was investing money and effort into destroying my reputation, treating me like an enemy to be defeated rather than a family member to be respected. When I told David about the private investigator, his reaction was different from his previous responses to his family's behavior. This wasn't impulsive or emotional, it was calculated and predatory. His mother had hired professionals to investigate his wife, crossing a line that even David's family loyalty couldn't rationalize. She's investigating you like you're a criminal, he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. I'm not the one who committed crimes, David. She is. And now she's trying to find ways to make me look like the guilty party. That evening, David called his mother for what would be their final conversation about our marriage. I listened from the kitchen as he spoke with a firmness I hadn't heard him use with his family before. He told Linda that hiring a private investigator to dig into his wife's background was unacceptable, that her social media attacks on my mental health were cruel and dishonest, and that her attempt to steal my belongings had permanently damaged his trust in her judgment. Linda's response was predictable: tears, accusations that I had poisoned David against his family, threats to cut him out of their lives if he continued to support my lies about their behavior. She demanded that he choose between his wife and his family, apparently confident that blood relationships would triumph over marital commitments. But David's choice was clear. If you can't respect my wife, then you can't be part of my life, he told his mother. Allison is my family now, and I'm not going to let you destroy our marriage, because you can't accept that I'm an adult who makes his own decisions. The call ended with Linda hanging up on her son, but not before making one final threat. You'll regret this decision when you discover what kind of person you really married, she said, and when you do, don't expect us to be here to help you clean up the mess. The threat was clear. Linda believed her private investigator would uncover something damaging about my past, something that would vindicate her behavior and turn David against me. She was so confident in her ability to destroy my reputation that she was willing to cut contact with her son while she waited for the ammunition she believed was coming. But I wasn't worried about what Linda's investigator might find, because there was nothing in my history that would support her narrative about my character. I had lived a quiet, responsible life, maintaining good relationships with friends and colleagues, managing my finances responsibly, and building a career based on creativity and reliability. The most damaging thing in my background was probably a speeding ticket from 3 years earlier. What worried me was what Linda might do when her investigation failed to produce the ammunition she expected. A person who had hired private investigators and mounted social media campaigns against her son's wife was not someone who would accept defeat gracefully. She would escalate again, finding new ways to attack what I valued most. Over the next 2 weeks, David and I began rebuilding our marriage without the constant interference of his family's demands and criticism. We had conversations about boundaries, about the difference between family loyalty and enabling abuse, about the ways his parents and sister had manipulated our relationship since our wedding day. For the first time in our marriage, our home felt truly private. I could arrange furniture without worrying about Linda's disapproval, display family photographs without defending their relevance, make decisions about our space without considering how they would be received by people who had never respected my right to have opinions about my own home. But the peace was temporary.
Linda had invested too much effort in destroying our marriage to simply walk away from the conflict. She had hired professionals, mobilized extended family members, and staked her reputation on proving that I was unfit to be her son's wife. She wasn't going to accept David's boundary setting as the final word on our relationship. The first sign of her continued campaign came through social media again. This time, she didn't attack me directly. Instead, she began sharing articles about the dangers of cutting contact with family members, the psychological damage caused by toxic spouses who isolated their partners, and the importance of maintaining family relationships despite temporary conflicts. Each article was accompanied by subtle commentary that made it clear she was talking about David and me without explicitly naming us. She shared posts about adult children who had been brainwashed by manipulative partners, stories about families torn apart by selfish in-laws, and advice for parents whose children had been stolen by controlling spouses. The narrative was sophisticated and patient. Linda was rebuilding her image as the wronged mother while positioning me as the manipulative wife who had destroyed her son's family relationships. She was creating a story that would resonate with other parents who felt shut out of their adult children's lives, building sympathy for her position while demonizing mine. But she was also gathering intelligence. Through mutual friends and extended family members, Linda was monitoring our activities, our social media presence, our professional commitments. She was waiting for an opportunity to strike back, looking for a moment when we were vulnerable or distracted. The opportunity came when David's construction company landed a major contract that required him to travel to Wyoming for 6 weeks. It was the kind of project that could significantly advance his career, but it would leave me alone in Denver with no buffer between myself and whatever Linda was planning. I don't feel comfortable leaving you alone with everything that's been happening, David told me when he explained the Wyoming opportunity. You have to take this job, I replied. We can't let your family's behavior control our professional decisions. I'll be fine. But even as I reassured David, I knew that Linda would view his absence as her chance to resume her campaign against our marriage. She had been building toward something for weeks, and David's travel would remove the one person whose opinion might restrain her behavior. I spent the week before David's departure updating my security systems, informing Attorney Williams about the timeline, and creating contingency plans for various scenarios. I knew Linda was planning something, but I couldn't predict what form her next attack would take. The answer came 3 days after David left for Wyoming, in the form of a knock on my door that would test everything I had learned about protecting myself from the Parker family's manipulation. The knock came at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening, just as the March sun was setting behind the Denver mountains. I was in my kitchen preparing dinner, listening to music and enjoying the peaceful routine of cooking for myself without having to consider anyone else's preferences or dietary restrictions. For the first time in months, my home felt truly mine. Through the front window I could see 2 figures standing on my porch under the yellow glow of the porch light. One was Linda, dressed in her usual combination of expensive casual wear and perfectly applied makeup despite the evening hour. The other was a woman I didn't recognize, someone roughly my age with short brown hair and a professional-looking navy blazer. I didn't answer the door. Instead, I activated my security system's recording function and watched through the cameras as Linda raised her hand to knock again. The unknown woman stood slightly behind her, holding a leather portfolio and checking her phone with the impatience of someone who had other appointments to keep. "Allison, we know you're home," Linda called through the door, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness that always preceded her most manipulative moments. "I have someone here who needs to speak with you about a very serious matter. It would be better for everyone if you opened the door voluntarily." The word voluntarily sent a chill down my spine. It implied that there might be involuntary alternatives, legal or official consequences if I refused to cooperate with whatever Linda had planned. But I had learned not to respond to her implied threats, and I remained silent in my kitchen while the security cameras captured their conversation. The unknown woman stepped forward and spoke directly to my door. "Mrs. Parker, my name is Rebecca Martinez, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. Your family has expressed serious concerns about your mental health and your potential danger to yourself and others. I'm here to conduct a welfare check and mental health evaluation as requested by your concerned relative." A mental health evaluation. Linda had found a new weapon in her campaign against my marriage, something that would be much more difficult to defend against than attempted theft or social media defamation. She was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent, using professional credentials to legitimize her claims about my supposedly unstable behavior. I called Attorney Williams immediately, speaking quietly into my phone while watching the 2 women through my security camera. The lawyer answered on the second ring, and I explained the situation as succinctly as possible. "Do not open that door," she instructed firmly. "A mental health professional cannot force entry into your home without a court order or immediate evidence of danger. If they had legal authority to evaluate you, they would have police backup and official documentation. This is harassment disguised as medical intervention." Attorney Williams explained that Linda had likely paid Dr. Martinez to conduct a private evaluation, presenting it as an official intervention to pressure me into compliance. It was a sophisticated form of psychological intimidation, using my respect for medical authority and my fear of legal consequences to manipulate me into submitting to an evaluation that would inevitably support Linda's narrative about my mental state. "Record everything," the attorney advised. "Let them document their own inappropriate behavior while you document your reasonable response to their harassment." I returned to the kitchen window and continued watching as Linda and Dr. Martinez discussed their options. The psychologist appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, checking her watch frequently and glancing toward her car as if reconsidering her involvement in whatever arrangement Linda had made. Linda knocked again. Harder this time. "Allison, you're only making this worse for yourself by refusing to cooperate."
Dr. Martinez is here to help you, but your behavior right now is concerning everyone who cares about you. David is going to be very disappointed when he learns that you refused professional help when it was offered. The mention of David was calculated to trigger my anxiety about my marriage, my fear that Linda's campaign might eventually succeed in turning my husband against me. She was suggesting that my refusal to submit to her chosen psychologist would be presented as evidence of my instability. Another data point in her ongoing effort to prove that I was unfit to be David's wife. But I had learned to recognize Linda's manipulation tactics, and I understood that submitting to her evaluation would be far more damaging than refusing it. Any psychologist who accepted payment from Linda to evaluate her son's wife was not an objective professional. They were a hired advocate for Linda's position in our family conflict. Dr. Martinez spoke again, her voice less confident than before. Ms. Parker, I want to assure you that this evaluation is completely voluntary and confidential. No one can force you to participate, and you have the right to refuse any assessment you don't feel comfortable with. The psychologist's words contradicted Linda's implications about voluntary versus involuntary cooperation, suggesting that Dr. Martinez was beginning to realize she had been misled about the nature of this intervention. Linda had probably presented our family conflict as a genuine mental health crisis, providing her own version of events without giving Dr. Martinez access to my perspective or the documented evidence of the Parker family's actual behavior. Martinez continued, I do want you to know that your family is genuinely concerned about your well-being. They've described some behaviors that suggest you might benefit from professional support, and I'm here to provide that support if you choose to accept it. I could see Linda nodding encouragingly, pleased that Dr. Martinez was maintaining the narrative about my family's concern for my well-being. But I could also see the psychologist's growing discomfort with the situation, her apparent realization that whatever she had been told about this evaluation didn't match the reality of standing on someone's porch trying to force an unwanted mental health assessment. Through my security cameras, I watched Linda and Dr. Martinez have a brief, heated conversation in voices too low for the microphones to capture clearly. The psychologist was shaking her head and pointing toward her car, while Linda was gesturing animatedly toward my front door. It appeared that Dr. Martinez was trying to leave while Linda was insisting that she complete whatever service she had been paid to provide. Finally, Dr. Martinez walked back to my door and spoke in a voice that carried a note of professional distance. Miss Parker, I'm going to leave my business card on your porch. If you decide you would like to schedule voluntary consultation, you can contact my office directly. Please know that any evaluation would be conducted according to professional ethical standards, with your consent and participation. I watched her place a business card under the corner of my doormat, then walk quickly to her car without further conversation with Linda. The psychologist's retreat left Linda standing alone on my porch, her carefully planned intervention collapsing as the professional she had hired recognized the ethical problems with the situation. But Linda wasn't finished. After Martinez drove away, she moved closer to my front door and spoke in a voice that carried none of her usual false sweetness. I know you're listening to every word I say, Alice. You think you're so clever with your little cameras and your lawyer friends, but you have no idea what I'm capable of when someone threatens my family. David is my son, and I'm not going to let you destroy his life with your selfishness and your need to be the victim in every situation. She paused, and I could see her looking directly into one of my security cameras, speaking to me through the electronic eyes I had installed to protect my home. You think you've won something by turning David against his family, but you've only postponed the inevitable. He's going to see through your manipulation, and when he does, you're going to find out what it feels like to have nothing and no one. I'm going to make sure of that. The threat was explicit and personal, delivered with the calm confidence of someone who believed she had the power to destroy my life whenever she chose to use it. Linda wasn't just angry about the conflict over my furniture or frustrated by David's boundary setting. She was declaring war on my existence, promising to eliminate me from her son's life by any means necessary. You can hide behind your locks and your legal threats, but I know things about you that David doesn't know yet. things that will change how he sees you forever. And when the time is right, when he's most vulnerable and dependent on family support, I'm going to make sure he learns exactly what kind of person he married. The implication was clear. Linda believed her private investigator had found something damaging in my background, something she was saving for the perfect moment to destroy my marriage. She was confident enough in this ammunition to make explicit threats about using it against me, suggesting that whatever she thought she had discovered was significant enough to change David's feelings about our relationship. But I knew there was nothing in my past that would support Linda's narrative about my character, which meant either her investigator had found nothing substantial, or Linda was bluffing about having damaging information. Either way, her threats revealed the depth of her desperation, and the extent to which she was willing to go to reclaim control over David's life. After Linda finally left my porch, I spent the evening reviewing the security footage and preparing a detailed report for Attorney Williams. Linda's attempt to use a mental health professional to legitimize her concerns about my stability was a new level of manipulation, but it was also evidence of criminal harassment that could be used against her if she continued escalating her campaign. The next morning, Dr. Naz called my cell phone directly. Her voice was professional but apologetic as she explained that she wanted to clarify her involvement in the previous evening's incident. Mrs. Parker, I want to apologize for any distress caused by my visit to your home last night. I was contacted by your mother-in-law with concerns about your mental health, and I agreed to conduct a welfare check based on the information she provided. However, I now realize that I was not given complete or accurate information about your family situation. Martinez explained that Linda had presented our conflict as a mental health crisis, describing my behavior in terms that suggested I was experiencing paranoid delusions and potentially dangerous instability. Linda had provided the psychologist with selected quotes from my social media posts, taken out of context to support her claims about my deteriorating mental state. I want you to know that I would never participate in any form of psychological harassment or manipulation, Dr. Martinez continued. If you choose to seek mental health support in the future, I encourage you to work with a provider who has no connection to your family conflict and who can offer truly objective assessment and treatment. The psychologist's call confirmed that Linda was willing to manipulate medical professionals to advance her campaign against my marriage. She had presented carefully edited information to Dr. Martinez using the legitimate concern of a mental health professional to legitimize her own agenda of proving that I was unfit to be David's wife. But Dr. Naz's recognition of the manipulation and her professional withdrawal from the situation also demonstrated that Linda's strategy had backfired. Instead of obtaining a professional evaluation that supported her claims about my instability, Linda had created evidence of her own willingness to abuse mental health resources for personal vendettas. I spent the rest of the week implementing additional security measures and preparing for whatever Linda might attempt next. Her escalation to fake mental health interventions suggested she was running out of conventional weapons in her campaign against my marriage, which meant she might resort to even more extreme tactics to achieve her goals. Carmen helped me research Linda's background, looking for patterns of similar behavior that might help us predict her next moves. What we discovered was disturbing but not entirely surprising. Linda had a history of conflicts with other family members who had challenged her authority or independence from her control. David's cousin had moved across the country after Linda interfered in his relationship, spreading rumors about his girlfriend's past that eventually destroyed their engagement. David's uncle had cut contact with the family after Linda manipulated a business dispute to force him out of a partnership with Robert. Even David's former girlfriend from college had experienced Linda's interference, finding herself the target of a social media campaign that portrayed her as a gold digger after she and David briefly reconciled following a breakup. The pattern was clear. Linda viewed any threat to her control over David's life as an enemy to be eliminated through systematic character assassination and social manipulation. I wasn't her first target, and if she succeeded in destroying my marriage, I wouldn't be her last. But I also had advantages that Linda's previous targets hadn't possessed. I had documentation of her behavior, legal representation, and most importantly, David's full support for my right to defend myself against his family's attack. Linda had underestimated my willingness to fight back and overestimated her ability to manipulate the situation without consequence. When David called that evening from his hotel in Wyoming, I told him about Linda's attempted mental health intervention and her explicit threats to destroy our marriage. His reaction was swift and decisive. He immediately called his mother and informed her that any further contact with me would result in a restraining order and criminal harassment charges. The conversation between David and Linda was their last as mother and son. She had pushed too far, revealing the depths of her willingness to destroy his wife's reputation and mental health to regain control over his life. David finally understood that his family's behavior wasn't motivated by love or concern. It was motivated by their inability to accept that he had chosen a partner they couldn't control. But Linda's final escalation was still coming. 2 days after David's confrontation with his mother, I received a package delivery that represented the culmination of months of planning and the darkest expression of Linda's hatred for my place in her son's life. The package was delivered by a process server, a legal professional who handed me an envelope marked urgent legal notice and required my signature to confirm receipt. Inside was a lawsuit filed against me in Denver County Court, alleging defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, based on my social media posts, documenting the Parker family's behavior. Linda was suing me for defending myself against her attacks, claiming that my factual documentation of her attempted theft and harassment had damaged her reputation and caused her severe emotional suffering. She was seeking monetary damages, a court order requiring me to remove all social media posts referencing her family, and a permanent injunction preventing me from discussing their behavior publicly. But the lawsuit was more than a legal attack. It was psychological warfare designed to exhaust my resources and resolve while positioning Linda as the victim of my supposedly malicious behavior. She was counting on the legal system to legitimize her narrative about our conflict, using court proceedings to force me into silence, while she continued her campaign to destroy my marriage. The accompanying legal documents included sworn affidavits from Robert and Brittany, supporting Linda's claims about my unstable behavior, along with character witnesses who testified to Linda's reputation as a loving mother and community member. The Parker family had mobilized their entire social network to present a unified front against me, painting my self-defense as unprovoked aggression. Most disturbingly, the lawsuit included references to information supposedly obtained through Linda's private investigation, suggesting that my pattern of deceptive behavior extended beyond our family conflict to other areas of my life. Linda was implying that her investigator had found evidence of dishonesty or instability that would support her claims about my character. But when I reviewed the specific allegations with Attorney Williams, it became clear that Linda's supposed evidence was either completely fabricated or based on dramatic misinterpretations of normal life events. Her investigator had apparently discovered that I had changed jobs twice in 5 years, which Linda characterized as evidence of instability and inability to maintain professional relationships. They had found that I had moved apartments 3 times during college, which Linda presented as evidence of rootlessness and inability to commit to responsibility. The most absurd allegation was based on my emergency room visit 2 years earlier for a broken wrist sustained while hiking, which Linda's legal team characterized as evidence of reckless behavior and poor judgment that endangered my safety and worried my family. They had somehow obtained my medical records through questionable means, and were using a routine injury as evidence of psychological instability. This lawsuit is frivolous and potentially criminal, Attorney Williams told me after reviewing the documentation. They've obtained your private medical information without authorization, they've made false statements about your character, and they've filed legal claims that have no basis in law. We're not just going to defend against this, we're going to use it to destroy their credibility permanently. The attorney explained that Linda's lawsuit would require her to testify under oath about her behavior toward me, subjecting her to cross-examination about the attempted theft, the harassment campaign, and the manipulation of medical professionals. Linda would have to defend her actions in open court, where her lies and manipulations would be exposed to legal scrutiny. She's made a strategic error, Attorney Williams continued. By filing this lawsuit, she's given us the right to subpoena her communications, depose her family members under oath, and present all of our evidence in a public forum. She thinks she's attacking you, but she's actually walked into a trap of her own making. But even as my lawyer explained the advantages of our legal position, I understood that Linda's lawsuit was designed to achieve psychological victory, regardless of its legal outcome. She was forcing me to spend months defending myself in court, using the legal system to continue her harassment, while presenting herself as the wronged party seeking justice. The stress of being sued was enormous, even when I knew the claims were false and ultimately defensible. Linda had turned my documentation of her criminal behavior into evidence of my supposed instability, using the legal system to continue her campaign of psychological warfare under the protection of court proceedings. When David learned about the lawsuit, his reaction was different from his previous responses to his family's escalations. This wasn't just harassment or manipulation. It was a formal legal attack that threatened our financial security and my professional reputation. Linda had declared total war on his wife, using every resource at her disposal to destroy the woman he had chosen to spend his life with. "I'm coming home," he told me during our phone call that evening. "The project can wait. This is more important." But I knew that David's early return from Wyoming would be exactly what Linda wanted. Evidence that her campaign was succeeding in disrupting our lives and forcing us to make professional sacrifices to deal with her attack. She was trying to prove that being married to me was too costly and complicated for David to sustain. "Stay and finish the job," I told him. "I can handle this legal fight, and we can't let your family destroy your career opportunities along with everything else they're trying to take from us." The next morning, I met with Attorney Williams to plan our comprehensive response to Linda's lawsuit. We weren't just going to defend against her claims, we were going to file counterclaims for harassment, attempted theft, defamation, and abuse of legal process. We were going to subpoena her communications with the private investigator, the psychologist, and her family members. We were going to expose every aspect of her campaign against my marriage in open court. But Linda had one final weapon that she hadn't used yet, something she had been saving for the moment when she felt most desperate and vindictive. 3 days after I received the lawsuit, she played her last card in a way that would test everything I had learned about fighting back against people who viewed my destruction as their right. The attack came through David's employer, a carefully crafted campaign designed to destroy his career while appearing to be motivated by legitimate concerns about his professional judgment and reliability. The call came from David's project manager at 6 in the morning, 3 days after I received Linda's lawsuit. I was still in my pajamas making coffee in my quiet kitchen when my phone rang with the urgency that always accompanies workplace emergency. "Allison, I need to speak with David immediately," Tom Martinez said, his voice tight with concern. "There's been a serious allegation made against him, and the company needs to address it before the situation gets worse." David was already on a job site in Wyoming, unreachable by phone until his lunch break. I took Tom's number and promised to have David call as soon as possible, but the pit in my stomach told me this wasn't a routine work issue. This was Linda's final attack, the weapon she had been saving for maximum damage.
When David called me back 2 hours later, his voice was strained with confusion and anger. His employer had received an anonymous letter, alleging that David was experiencing severe personal problems that were affecting his professional judgment and reliability. The letter claimed that David's wife was mentally unstable, and that their domestic situation had become so chaotic that it posed a liability risk for any project he supervised. The anonymous letter included references to police involvement in domestic disputes, suggests that David was drinking heavily to cope with stress at home, and claims that his family was so concerned about his welfare that they were considering legal intervention to protect him from his dangerous wife. Everything was carefully worded to sound like genuine concern from someone who knew David personally and was worried about his professional reputation. But David and I both knew exactly who had written that letter, and we understood that Linda had finally found a way to attack both of us simultaneously. By targeting David's career, She was forcing him to choose between defending his wife and protecting his professional future. She was betting that the threat to his livelihood would succeed where her previous attacks on me had failed. The letter had been sent to David's project manager, the regional director, and the company's human resources department, ensuring maximum visibility and creating a paper trail that would follow David throughout his career. Even if the allegations were ultimately disproven, the suggestion that he was unreliable due to personal problems would shadow his professional reputation indefinitely. "They're putting me on administrative leave pending an investigation," David told me, his voice hollow with disbelief. 20 years of perfect work history, and now I'm suspended because my mother sent lies to my employer. The suspension was the breakthrough I needed to finally take decisive action against Linda's campaign. She had crossed the line from harassing me to destroying David's career, giving us grounds for criminal charges that would carry serious consequences. Attorney Williams had been waiting for Linda to make a mistake that would expose her to prosecution, and targeting David's employment was exactly the kind of escalation that would interest law enforcement. "We're filing charges today," Attorney Williams told me when I called with the news about David's suspension: "criminal harassment, interference with employment, defamation, and abuse of process. Linda Parker has committed multiple felonies in her campaign against your marriage, and it's time for her to face real consequences." But even as we prepared our legal offensive, I knew that Linda's attack on David's career was designed to achieve immediate psychological victory regardless of its ultimate legal consequence. She was counting on the stress and financial pressure to break our marriage before any court proceedings could provide relief. David came home from Wyoming that afternoon, arriving at our house with the defeated expression of someone whose professional identity had been stripped away by malicious lies. He sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by the furniture his family had tried to steal, processing the reality that his mother had destroyed his career to punish him for protecting his wife. "She's won," he said quietly, staring at the termination letter his employer had given him despite 20 years of excellent service. "Even if we prove the allegations are false, no construction company is going to hire someone whose family creates this kind of drama. She's ended my career to get back at you." But I could see something else in David's expression beyond defeat and anger. For the first time since I had known him, he was seeing his family with complete clarity, understanding the depths of manipulation and cruelty they were capable of when their control was threatened. The people who claimed to love him had destroyed his professional life to punish him for choosing his wife over their demands. "She hasn't won anything," I told him firmly. "She's just committed multiple felonies that are going to send her to prison. And we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person she really is." That evening, I made a decision that would change everything about our situation. Instead of continuing to react defensively to Linda's attacks, I was going to expose her behavior to everyone who knew her, using her own social network against her in a way that would destroy her reputation permanently. I spent the night creating a comprehensive documentation of Linda's campaign against our marriage, organizing every piece of evidence we had gathered over the months of conflict: security footage of her attempted break-in, recordings of her threats, screenshots of her defamatory social media posts, copies of the frivolous lawsuit, and now evidence of her attack on David's career. I arranged everything chronologically, creating a timeline that showed the systematic escalation of her harassment and the calculated nature of her campaign. But instead of posting this documentation on my own social media accounts, where Linda could dismiss it as biased perspective, I sent it directly to every person in Linda's social and professional network: her church congregation, her country club friends, her professional associations, her extended family members, her neighbors. Everyone who had seen her carefully curated public image received detailed evidence of her private behavior. The message I sent was simple and factual: Linda Parker has spent months trying to destroy my marriage through theft, harassment, defamation, and now criminal interference with my husband's employment. Here is documented evidence of her behavior. You deserve to know what kind of person she really is behind her public facade. The response was immediate and devastating for Linda's reputation. People who had known her for years were shocked by the evidence of her criminal behavior and systematic cruelty. Church members who had admired her community involvement were horrified by the recordings of her threats and manipulation. Professional colleagues who had respected her social status
were disgusted by her willingness to destroy her son's career for personal vendetta. Within hours, Linda's carefully constructed social image collapsed completely. The people who had supported her during her public campaign against me now understood that they had been manipulated into enabling harassment and criminal behavior. Her friends began distancing themselves publicly, posting their own statements about being deceived by her false narrative. But the most damaging responses came from Linda's other victims, people who had been silenced by her manipulation for years, but now felt empowered to speak out about their own experience. David's cousin shared the story of how Linda had destroyed his engagement through lies and character assassination. David's uncle described the business manipulation that had forced him out of the family company. Even David's former girlfriend came forward with her account of Linda's social media campaign designed to destroy her relationship with David. A pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore or dismiss. Linda Parker was a serial manipulator who had spent decades destroying anyone who threatened her control over her family members. The evidence was overwhelming, documented and corroborated by multiple victims spanning many years. Linda's response to the exposure was swift and revealing. Instead of denying the allegations or attempting to defend her behavior, she immediately hired a crisis management firm and began a campaign to present herself as the victim of a coordinated attack by unstable individuals seeking to destroy her reputation. She claimed that all the evidence against her had been fabricated or taken out of context, and that the multiple victims coming forward were part of a conspiracy orchestrated by me to turn her family and friends against her. But Linda's defensive strategy only made her situation worse. The crisis management firm's statements were so obviously false and manipulative that they further damaged her credibility. Her attempts to dismiss documented evidence as fabrication only highlighted the extent of her dishonesty. Her characterization of multiple independent victims as conspirators revealed the paranoid thinking that had driven her campaign against my marriage. Most importantly, Linda's crisis management campaign proved that she had significant financial resources to spend on destroying other people's lives, undermining her claims to be a concerned mother acting out of love for her son. The revelation that she had hired professionals to manipulate public opinion about our family conflict showed the calculated, predatory nature of her behavior. The legal consequences of Linda's campaign began falling into place with stunning speed. The criminal harassment charges were filed and accepted by the district attorney's office, which had received similar complaints about Linda's behavior from other victims. The interference with David's employment constituted felony criminal mischief, carrying potential prison time and substantial fines. The abuse of legal process in her frivolous lawsuit against me triggered sanctions that would require her to pay our legal fees and face possible disbarment proceedings against her attorney. But Linda had one final desperation move that revealed just how far she was willing to go to avoid accountability for her action. 3 days after the criminal charges were filed, she attempted to flee the state, apparently believing that crossing state lines would somehow protect her from prosecution. The attempt to flee was discovered when Linda failed to appear for a scheduled deposition in her lawsuit against Attorney Williams, contacted the court, which issued a bench warrant for Linda's arrest when her lawyer could not produce her for testimony. Within hours, Linda was arrested at Denver International Airport, attempting to board a flight to Florida where she apparently believed she could hide with distant relatives. The arrest at the airport was captured by news cameras, creating images that permanently destroyed any remaining sympathy for Linda's position. The woman who had claimed to be a concerned mother protecting her son from a dangerous wife was revealed to be a fugitive, fleeing from criminal charges for harassment and obstruction of justice. Linda's arrest triggered a cascade of additional consequences that she had not anticipated. Her attempt to flee demonstrated consciousness of guilt, strengthening the prosecution's case against her. Her abandonment of the lawsuit she had filed against me resulted in automatic dismissal with prejudice, meaning she could never refile similar claims. Most devastatingly, her arrest became public record, ensuring that anyone who searched her name online would find evidence of her criminal behavior. David's employer, faced with clear evidence that the allegations against him had been fabricated by a woman now facing criminal charges, immediately reinstated him with full back pay and a formal apology. The company's investigation revealed that Linda had used false information to manipulate their human resources department, making them unwitting participants in her harassment campaign. But David's reinstatement came with an unexpected bonus. The company's legal department, recognizing that they had been victims of Linda's manipulation, offered to support civil litigation against her for the damage she had caused to their business reputation and employee relations. David suddenly had corporate resources, backing his own defamation claims against his mother. The civil lawsuit that emerged from Linda's attacks was comprehensive and devastating. We sued her for harassment, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, interference with employment, attempted theft and abuse of legal process. The damages we sought included compensation for David's lost wages, my legal fees, the security systems I had installed to protect our home, and punitive damages designed to deter similar behavior in the future. Linda's criminal trial began 6 months later, and the evidence presented in court was even more damaging than what I had shared with her social network. The prosecution had uncovered additional victims, documented patterns of behavior spanning decades, and gathered evidence that showed the premeditated nature of Linda's campaign against our marriage. The most compelling testimony came from Dr. Martinez, the psychologist Linda had manipulated into attempting the mental health evaluation. Dr. Martinez explained how Linda had used selective information and emotional manipulation to convince a licensed professional to participate in harassment, disguised as medical intervention. The doctor's testimony revealed the sophisticated nature of Linda's psychological manipulation and her willingness to abuse professional relationships to advance her personal vendettas. Linda's own testimony during the trial was a disaster for her defense. Under cross-examination, she was forced to admit to lying about her reasons for entering our home, falsifying information to manipulate professionals, and deliberately targeting David's career to punish him for supporting his wife. Her attempts to justify her behavior as motherly concern were undermined by the documented evidence of her threats and the testimony of her other victims. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all criminal charges. Linda was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 3 years of probation, and ordered to pay restitution covering our legal fees and David's lost wages. The judge noted that Linda's systematic campaign of harassment represented a particularly egregious abuse of family relationships, and warned that any violation of the restraining order protecting us would result in additional prison time. The civil lawsuit was resolved even more favorably. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a jury trial that would further expose her behavior, Linda agreed to a settlement that included substantial monetary damages and a permanent injunction preventing any future contact with David or me. The settlement also required her to post a public apology acknowledging her criminal behavior and the falseness of her claims about my mental health and character. But the most satisfying consequence of Linda's campaign was not legal or financial. It was the complete destruction of her social and professional reputation. The woman who had spent decades manipulating family relationships and destroying other people's lives was now widely known as a criminal and manipulator. Her church membership was revoked, her country club membership was terminated, and her professional associations distanced themselves from her criminal behavior. Robert filed for divorce while Linda was in prison, apparently unwilling to be associated with her criminal behavior or to continue supporting her legal battles. Brittany, faced with evidence of her mother's manipulation and the collapse of her family's social standing, cut contact with Linda and reached out to David with an apology for her participation in the harassment campaign. David's reconciliation with Brittany was gradual and conditional, based on her willingness to acknowledge the harm she had caused and her commitment to rebuilding their relationship without Linda's toxic influence. She provided additional evidence of Linda's manipulation, including recordings of conversations where Linda had explicitly discussed plans to destroy our marriage and eliminate me from David's life. The most unexpected development was the response from Linda's other victims, who began organizing to support each other and to ensure that Linda's pattern of behavior was permanently documented. A support group formed for people who had been targeted by Linda's manipulation, creating a network that would prevent her from isolating and victimizing future targets.
David and I used the settlement money to relocate to a different neighborhood, buying a house where Linda had never been and where we could create new memories without the shadow of her harassment. The new home became a sanctuary where my grandmother's china could be displayed without fear, where my family's quilts could drape the furniture without criticism, where photographs of my heritage could occupy places of honor without threat of removal. Our new house also became a gathering place for David's extended family members who had been estranged by Linda's manipulation over the years. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends who had been driven away by Linda's controlling behavior began reconnecting with David, sharing their own stories of her interference and manipulation. We discovered that Linda had been systematically isolating David from potential supporters for years, ensuring that her voice was the only family influence in his life. The restoration of David's family relationships was healing for both of us. We learned about relatives who had wanted to maintain connections, but had been prevented by Linda's interference. We heard stories about family gatherings we had never been invited to, holiday celebrations that Linda had controlled by excluding anyone who might challenge her authority. Most importantly, David gained perspective on the normalcy of our marriage compared to the dysfunction he had grown up accepting as typical family behavior. He began to understand that healthy families don't steal from each other, don't attack each other's mental health, don't try to destroy each other's careers when their control is threatened. The therapy we attended together helped David process the emotional abuse he had experienced throughout his life, recognizing patterns of manipulation and control that he had internalized as expressions of love and concern. He learned to distinguish between genuine family support and the conditional approval that Linda had used to maintain her authority over his decisions. For me, the therapy provided tools for managing the trauma of systematic harassment and for rebuilding my sense of safety in relationships with David's family members. I learned to trust my instincts about manipulation, to document concerning behavior before it escalated, and to advocate for myself without guilt or apology. But the most valuable outcome of our ordeal was the strength it built in our marriage. We had survived a coordinated campaign designed to destroy our relationship, emerging with deeper trust, clearer communication, and absolute certainty about our commitment to each other. Linda's attacks had tested every aspect of our partnership, proving that we could weather external pressure without losing our fundamental connection. 3 years after Linda's arrest, I received a letter from a young woman named Ashley, whose mother-in-law had begun exhibiting similar patterns of manipulation and control. Ashley had found documentation of our story online and was seeking advice about protecting her own marriage from family interference. The letter reminded me that Linda's behavior was not unique, that many people struggle with toxic family members who view their relationships as threats to be eliminated rather than bonds to be celebrated. Ashley's situation had familiar elements: criticism of her belongings, attempts to isolate her from her husband, manipulation of professional relationships to create pressure on their marriage. I responded to Ashley's letter with detailed advice about documentation, legal protection, and strategic response to escalating harassment. I shared the resources that had helped David and me, the warning signs we had learned to recognize, and the importance of early intervention before manipulative behavior escalated to criminal harassment. Ashley's gratitude for the guidance reminded me that our experience, as painful as it had been, could serve a larger purpose in helping other people recognize and respond to similar abuse. The documentation and strategies we had developed could be tools for other victims of family manipulation, resources for people who were just beginning to understand that their in-laws' behavior was not normal family conflict. I began writing about our experience more systematically, creating a guide for people dealing with toxic in-laws who used family relationships to justify criminal behavior. The guide included practical advice about security systems, legal documentation, strategic communication, and the importance of professional support during extended harassment campaigns. The response to the guide was overwhelming. Hundreds of people reached out with their own stories of family manipulation, sharing experiences that ranged from subtle emotional abuse to outright criminal behavior. The patterns were remarkably consistent across different families and geographic regions, suggesting that toxic in-law behavior follows predictable scripts that can be anticipated and countered. Most importantly, the people who contacted me were able to protect themselves more effectively because they understood Linda's playbook. They recognized the escalation patterns, documented behavior early,
and sought legal protection before harassment campaigns reached criminal level. They were able to save their marriages, protect their careers, and maintain their sense of self-worth despite sustained attacks from people who claimed to love their spouse. David became an advocate for men whose families were manipulating their marriages, speaking at support groups and sharing his perspective on the difficulty of choosing between family loyalty and marital commitment. His willingness to acknowledge his mother's criminal behavior and to support his wife's right to protection resonated with other men who were struggling with similar conflict. Together, we created a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting people dealing with toxic family relationships, providing resources for documentation, legal referrals, and emotional support during harassment campaigns. The organization grew out of our recognition that family abuse is often dismissed or minimized because of cultural assumptions about blood relationships and family loyalty. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply satisfying. Every person we helped protect their marriage was a victory against the kind of manipulation Linda had used against us. Every family that learned to set healthy boundaries was proof that toxic patterns could be broken, and that love did not require accepting abuse from relatives. Linda was released from prison after serving 14 months of her sentence, but her attempts to rebuild her life were unsuccessful. Her criminal record prevented her from obtaining professional employment. Her social isolation continued as former friends avoided association with her, and her financial resources were depleted by legal fees and settlement payments. She made one attempt to contact David through a third party, claiming that her time in prison had given her perspective on her mistakes and that she wanted to make amends for her behavior. But David recognized the approach as another manipulation attempt, designed to test whether his boundaries had weakened during her incarceration. David's response was firm and final. He informed Linda's intermediary that any attempt at contact would be reported to law enforcement as a violation of the restraining order. He made it clear that her criminal behavior had permanently severed their relationship, and that he had no interest in reconciliation or communication. The finality of David's rejection was difficult for him emotionally, representing the complete loss of the family relationships that had shaped his early life, but it was also liberating, freeing him from the anxiety and manipulation that had shadowed our marriage for years. He could make decisions about our future without considering his family's reactions or preparing for their interference. 5 years after the attempted theft of my grandmother's china, David and I hosted Thanksgiving dinner in our new home for the extended family members who had reconnected with us after Linda's removal from their lives. The dining room table was set with my great-grandmother's porcelain, the living room was decorated with my great-aunt's quilts, and the walls displayed photographs spanning 4 generations of my family's history. The gathering was everything Linda had tried to prevent, a celebration that honored multiple family traditions, incorporated diverse perspectives and backgrounds, and created space for everyone to contribute their own stories and customs. The house was filled with laughter, conversation, and the comfortable chaos of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. As I watched David carving turkey at the table surrounded by my grandmother's china, I reflected on how different our lives might have been if Linda had succeeded in her campaign to control our marriage. The woman who had tried to erase my family's presence from our home had instead created the circumstances that strengthened our appreciation for heritage, tradition, and the importance of protecting what we value most. The empty chair at our table, the space where Linda might have sat if she had chosen love over control, served as a reminder that family is defined by behavior rather than biology. The people gathered around our table had earned their places through respect, support, and genuine care for our well-being. They had chosen to build relationships rather than demand submission. David raised his glass for a toast, looking around the table at faces that reflected acceptance, encouragement, and authentic affection. To family, he said, his voice carrying gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment of peace and celebration. To the people who show up with love instead of conditions, who support our choices instead of trying to control them, and who understand that the strongest families are built on respect rather than fear. The toast was met with unanimous agreement from people who had witnessed our struggle and supported our right to build a marriage based on our own values and priorities. They understood that the china, the quilts, and the photographs were not just objects but symbols of identity. heritage, and the right to maintain connections to the people and traditions that had shaped us before we found each other. Later that evening, after our guests had gone home and David and I were cleaning up the remnants of our celebration, I found myself standing in front of my grandmother's china cabinet, remembering the day Linda had photographed each piece with the intention of removing it from my life forever. The porcelain had survived immigration, war, economic hardship, and family upheaval to reach my table, but it had nearly been lost to the kind of small-minded cruelty that views other people's heritage as inconvenient. David joined me in front of the cabinet, wrapping his arms around me from behind and resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the furniture and decorations that had become symbols of our right to choose our own path forward. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had given in to their demands?" David asked quietly. I considered the question seriously, imagining a parallel life where I had allowed Linda to remove my family's belongings, where I had accepted her narrative about my mental health, where I had remained silent about their harassment to preserve peace in the family. "We would have lost ourselves," I said finally, "piece by piece, demand by demand, until there was nothing left of who we were before we met them. They weren't just trying to change our furniture, they were trying to erase everything about me that didn't serve their vision of your future." David nodded, understanding that the conflict had never really been about home decoration or family dynamic. It had been about the right to exist as complete individuals within our marriage, to bring our full histories and identities to our shared life without apologizing for the complexity that authenticity creates. "I'm proud of us for fighting back," he said, "for refusing to disappear just because it would have been easier for them." Standing in our living room surrounded by the evidence of our victory, my grandmother's furniture, my family's photographs, the legal documents that had protected our rights, and most important, the peace that came from knowing we had chosen each other over the people who demanded our compliance, I understood that Linda's greatest failure had been her misunderstanding of love itself. She had confused control with care, manipulation with concern, and submission with respect. She had believed that love meant the right to reshape other people according to her preferences, to demand that they sacrifice their identities for her comfort. But real love, the kind that David and I had built together, was about celebrating each other's authenticity rather than trying to edit it. The war Linda had declared on our marriage had ultimately strengthened our bond and clarified our value. We had learned to document truth, to seek professional guidance when facing manipulation, to trust our instincts about toxic behavior, and to fight for our right to build a life that reflected our own choices rather than other people's demands. Most importantly, we had learned that family is not determined by blood relationships or legal obligations, but by the willingness to support each other's growth, respect each other's boundaries, and create space for authentic connection. The people around our Thanksgiving table had become our chosen family, earning their places through consistent demonstrations of love rather than demanding them through claims of biological entitlement. As David and I finished cleaning up from our celebration and prepared to go to bed in the house Linda had tried to control, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this place of security and peace. The woman who had tried to destroy our marriage had instead given us the opportunity to prove its strength, to test our commitment under pressure, and to emerge with absolute certainty about our choice to build a life together. The china was safe in its cabinet, the quilts were draped over furniture we had chosen together, and the photographs on our walls told the story of families who had overcome challenges to create lasting love. We had added our own chapter to that story, documenting our refusal to let other people's dysfunction determine our future. In the quiet of our bedroom, surrounded by the security we had fought to protect, David and I fell asleep with the satisfaction that comes from knowing we had faced the worst that family manipulation could offer, and emerged with our marriage, not just intact but stronger than ever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.